Alhamdulillah wa salatu wasalam ala Rasulillah. After covering al-ulu in isnad, the high asanid with shorter chains, whether it's closer to Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam or closer to one of the imma of hadith, Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani brings a subject in al-Nuzhat that most people don't appreciate. When we talk about mustalah al-hadith and the science of hadith, when we're talking about sahih and da'if and hasan and maybe even mawquf and marfu', everybody's on it. Most people who study nukhba or nuzhat al-Nadhr, which we're studying, which is the sharh of nukhbat al-fikr. In the beginning part of the book, they're good. You get to the last part of the book, they're lost. People like myself who are interested in actually researching asanid and rawat and right in this subject, this is the most important part, is the last part of the book, because it gives you practical implementation of how to look at a sanad and evaluate. In fact, the last part of Nuzhat al-Nadhr is a little bit away from mustalah al-hadith as it is, because mustalah al-hadith is really the science of classification of ahadith. Istalah, the terminology used to classify ahadith. Here he's going to talk about some of the practical tools, and after this he will even get into a little bit of jarh wa ta'dil. But this is important, and I'm going to try to simplify it to make it easy for those who may not be well versed in the science but want to know what is the practical implementation of some of this. فقال المؤلف, the muallif says, فإن تشارك الراوي, يعني if the rawi shares min rawa anhu, from the one who narrates from him, fi sinni, in age or in the luqya, يعني in as who they met and who they didn't, and the time period that they were in, al-Aqrān. So this is a type of, and we'll talk about it inshallah, I'm just reading a part of the matan first. This is a type of classification of a chain where you have narrators that have some characteristics that are in common, and this is called Aqrān. وإن روى كل منهما عن الآخر فالدباج. Now you have idbaj, which we'll talk about. Mudabaj is the term used for the actual type of hadith. If each one of them reports from the other. What does that mean? In one sanad, for example, Shadh reports from Abdurrahman. So here, as we discussed earlier, who is the Shaykh? Abdurrahman. Who is the Rawi? Shadh. He reports from him. But sometimes what happens is, in another sanad, Abdurrahman reports from Shadh. Now who's the Shaykh? Shadh. Who's the Rawi? Abdurrahman. So now, this is a type of checking. Mudabbaj is what is called. Idbaj, we'll talk about what that really means and what all they have in there. Tayyib, so let me explain a little bit now. What does it mean first that if the narrators share some of the same characteristics? As Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani, he explains in Nuzhat al-Nadhr, he says this is a type of hadith or sanad that's called Aqrān. This is a particular science, and that's when each one of the contemporaries report from the other, then that is Mudabbaj. This is Mudabbaj. Idbaj is what it's called. And this is more specific. So what does he say? Ibn Hajar says something very interesting. He goes, every Mudabbaj is Aqrān, but not every Aqrān is Mudabbaj. They memorize that. Every Mudabbaj hadith is Aqrān, but not every Aqrān hadith is Mudabbaj. And then he mentions that Imam al-Darqutni, Imam al-Hafiz al-Darqutni, amazing scholar, especially if you study ilal and hadith, he's well known. So he's saying he wrote a book on this, and this is a book called al-Mudabbaj by al-Darqutni. I have a manuscript of it. It's very beneficial work. And Abu Shaykh al-Isfahani, he wrote a book on the Aqrān, Rawayat al-Aqrān, and this is the style of Ibn Hajar, that this is a beginning text. Even Nuzhat al-Nadhr, which is a Sharh of Nukhba, is still a beginning text. So he's giving you other books to further research these subjects. If you want to know more about the subject, then you can look up these books. Tayyib. So what does it mean? When the shaykh reports from his rawi. Tayyib, when we talk about a shaykh in hadith, who is that? The one who reports the hadith. The one who hears the hadith and reports from him is a rawi. Then it is true that each one of them now is reporting from the other. But would you consider that Mudabbaj? So here he says in this there is khilaf. And you could argue on this issue. Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani says there is khilaf. He says, according to him, what is adhar, what is apparent, is that this is not called Mudabbaj, because it is the reporting from a senior, from the akbar min al-asghar. And that's a type in hadith that we'll discuss later. So what does he say? That don't consider a hadith where a shaykh who is an actual teacher of a student reports a hadith from his student, that's not called Mudabbaj. He says because tadbij is from the baja, which is the cheeks of the face, so it suggests that they be equal. Now he gets into linguistics here, right? He says this comes from a word for the cheeks of the face, so they're equals. So if there is a shaykh, and the shaykh who is a alim, who is senior, reports a hadith from his student, and his student is junior, but his student may know a hadith that the shaykh doesn't know, or he may have got the hadith from somewhere else. But that does not consider that to be Mudabbaj. Why Mudabbaj is when people who are close to the same status are reporting from each other. But all of that will be under Aqrān. So this is why we go back to the usul, that every Mudabbaj hadith, Mudabbaj is what now? Simplifying. Right? Two people who are somewhat contemporary. One may be younger, one may be, but they're about the same. They both report a hadith from each other. That's Mudabbaj. Aqrān is a broader term than that. In Aqrān, people who may have other similarities are reporting from each other that would not be equal. Some people have the same name style, right? We'll talk about this. Some people have just the age issue. But age doesn't always necessitate who has more knowledge. So this is to understand some of the linguistics. Now I want to make a point that I wrote down in my notes long time ago when I was studying a nukhba, not even nuzha. And this is why, like for me, I'm a big proponent of writing notes in a book. Because I wrote this in a little matan that I had, just a side note. Then later when I typed it up and so on, I transferred it. But alhamdulillah, it benefited me. Even this time when I was about to prepare, I pulled up one of my books, I found that note handwritten, and I realized the benefit of it. Which is that most people, when we talk about Mudabbaj, they don't understand the benefit of it. Like, what's the point? But Shaykhuna Ibn Uthaymeen, Shaykh Muhammad Salih Ibn Uthaymeen, he explained this as my teacher recorded from him. He said that sometimes people forget that a hadith is taken from the shaykh, and the shaykh may have better memory and not have forgotten, and a disciple may take the hadith from a contemporary who's heard it from the shaykh, but they are two different people. What does that mean? So there is a shaykh and he's reporting a hadith, and somebody here, let's say Shaykhuna Musalim, he reports a hadith, and Mukarram and Abdurrahman are both sitting and they hear the hadith. Now, when they report the hadith, when Abdurrahman reports from Mukarram in one sanad, in another sanad, Mukarram reports from Abdurrahman. What is the zahir to somebody who hasn't studied this science is that somebody switched the sanad, right? Because how can somebody be at the teacher level here and be at the student level here? So this is one thing. When we know who were contemporaries and shared a shaykh and then reported to each other, or shared